one of the reasons he was somewhat ambivalent about my idea for writing this book is like, when's the book going to be published? In a year? Where are we going to be in a year? Where's the war going to be in a year? Are you crazy? I mean, I can't think about that far ahead. So he thinks minute to minute, day to day. What are we doing today to advance, the cause of Ukraine, to bring our victory closer?
So the book is called The Showman, and I suppose that's a reflection of the fact that he became famous originally as a showman, as a comic. Is he still the showman? We talk about his making of a leader. Has he moved from showman to leader, or is that still part of who Vladimir Zelensky is?
I think showman and leader are not mutually exclusive, especially in our age of politics. I would say that I chose the title because his showmanship during this invasion has proved to be his superpower. It was critical from the very first moments of the invasion for Ukraine to rally the support of the world, to grab and hold the world's attention for as long as possible. And Zelensky's particular skill set in understanding, how to tell a story, how to keep the attention of an audience, and to keep them, as he puts it, from scrolling away, from changing the channel. Those skills turned out to be, to the surprise of many, certainly to my surprise while writing this book, absolutely essential to Ukraine's success in beating back the Russian invasion, and indeed now putting the Russian Goliath on the back foot on the defensive. So that is why.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it feels almost like quite an old-fashioned concept. When because in the UK, we look back to sort of Churchill and that ability through words and pictures and propaganda to take a nation through a really tough time. And you sort of think, well, we've moved on from all of that. Now you want someone who understands strategy and weapons and all that sort of stuff. But actually, when you're a leader of people, they are people skills which are universal, the same ones that would have had previously a king addressing a crowd on horseback, whatever it might be. He's just done it in a modern age.
I think so, yeah. And it's interesting you bring up Churchill. I asked him once in one of our interviews during the invasion what he thought about these comparisons to Winston Churchill, and he wasn't that happy with that comparison. He wasn't a big fan of Churchill's support of imperialism, because Zelensky sees the current war in Ukraine as fundamentally an anti-imperialist war. And he chose to compare himself, interestingly, to other figures from the Churchill era, specifically Charlie Chaplin. He raised the example of Charlie Chaplin, and he said, there were these artists in the past who used their influence, who used words, who used art to fight wars, to wage wars. Information wars primarily, but he said their influence was often stronger than artillery, and I think that's the kind of legacy that he wants to have, more in the lineage of Chaplin as a warfighter through art, through words, through information, than a kind of a battlefield commander moving tanks around on a map.
That's really interesting. That, and I suppose as well that coming from that performing tradition and knowing the image and costume matters. We think about, but I suppose Charlie Chaplin, the bowler hat, and Churchill with the cigar, and and the V for victory. And he's adopted a very similar thing, with the sort of the uniform that he's wearing, the olive green sweatshirt or t-shirt, and the combats, and even when he's been out of Ukraine and he's addressed parliaments or that sort of thing, standing aside from traditional politicians in suits and shirts and ties. Yeah. That's clearly part of the showman in him as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the book kind of takes you behind the scenes of how they think about these decisions, up to and including what he wears, how he presents himself visually. The way they talk about it is very much in the vocabulary of showmanship, constructing a narrative, telling a story, presenting the hero, presenting the bad guy, right? The Putin and the Russians. So they think about it in these terms. I think part of the reason is that not only President Zelensky, but a lot of his advisors come from the world of entertainment, political public relations, TV production, movie making. So this is in many ways how they think, and the book kind of includes a number of conversations where Zelensky and his advisors talk about their strategy in these terms of showing the world the image of the war that they want the world to see.
And then contrast that to Putin, who has adopted this quite old-fashioned
Yeah.
sort of Russian leader approach, where it's all about how many tanks can you get on the streets, although sometimes they break down, which is slightly embarrassing, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, Putin clearly underestimated the guy off the telly
Mhm.
when invading Ukraine, and that being the guy off the telly wasn't a weakness, but actually became part of his strength.
That's right. Yeah, and the book presents, uh, I think, President Putin also in living color. I've been a reporter covering Russia and Ukraine for 17 years, so I've lived in Russia as a reporter for 7 of those years. I've studied Putin closely, so he's presented in the book as the contrast could not be more dramatic. That he's a foil that really allows us to see some of the qualities of Zelensky as well, in contrast to Putin. Putin is isolated. He, makes a point of meeting many leaders, especially Western leaders, at this great, almost comical distance. Right, these long tables that we saw in 2022, where a visitor would come from France or Germany, and Putin would demonstratively keep them at a distance. Also with his people, he was not the kind of backslapping, handshaking, baby kissing politician that in many ways Zelensky has always tried to be since he entered politics.
And what about, because you write about his relationship, not just then obviously with Putin, but with other world leaders. Take us inside some of those relationships, because lots of people in the UK who have quite a dim view, particularly of Boris Johnson,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
have been quite surprised by both his ongoing commitment to what's been happening in Ukraine, and actually, but give us a sense of, is Boris Johnson right that he's sort of best mates with Vladimir Zelensky? Because obviously when our prime minister goes anywhere, we think, well, that's interesting, they've gone there. The extent to which it's actually true about that, but take us inside that relationship, the Zelensky relationship with, I don't know, Boris Johnson and now Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, there's so much I could say about that. There's quite a bit about Boris Johnson here, and I can confirm that indeed President Zelensky and his team see Boris Johnson as their best friend over the course of this invasion. The first person, the first international leader that President Zelensky called on the morning of the invasion was Boris Johnson. One of the reasons was they had each other's phone numbers. So normally heads of state communicate through these fairly complex protocol services where you have to arrange a secure line in advance and so on. It takes time. Zelensky always hated that. He hated the kind of the protocols and the rules of behavior for a head of state. And he always asked leaders, "Hey, can I just get your number? We can like chat on WhatsApp, and I can text you." Many of them were not comfortable with that because of security rules, but Boris Johnson was, and they developed a relationship in part because they were able to communicate, directly and closely. And his commitment, the words of support that he told to Zelensky were really heartening and inspiring for him. That is true.
And what about Rishi Sunak? Is it the connection as strong?
I wouldn't say so. No, I mean, I'll say this: when Boris Johnson ceased to be prime minister, there was a lot of disappointment and worry in Kyiv, in the presidential compound, because he was such a firm supporter. The UK was never the biggest provider in absolute numbers of military hardware and financial aid, but in spirit, in his words, in the force of his messaging and support for Ukraine, he did stand out. So the Ukrainians really hoped that they would see the same thing in Sunak when he became prime minister. I didn't follow it that closely, but I wouldn't say that he stands out in the way that Boris Johnson did in the list of Ukrainian allies.
And then, sort of looking ahead a bit as to where this goes, it was a conflict that people thought wouldn't happen, hope wouldn't happen, happened, and now we're coming up to 2 years of it unfolding, and in a world which seems more unstable, and the possibility of Donald Trump returning to the White House.
Mm.
How does that play on the mind of Vladimir Zelensky and the team around him? The guy who says he can do a deal to end the war in 24 hours, which everyone assumes means getting Zelensky to give loads of ground away to Moscow. Tell us about the sort of the thinking about Donald Trump.
Well, I think it's quite clear that Donald Trump's re-election in the U.S. would be a catastrophe for Ukraine. He said quite clearly that he would cut off aid in order to force Ukraine into some kind of negotiation or capitulation to the Russians. The Ukrainians think about this in a fairly cold and calculating way. They are preparing for the possibility that aid from the West would continue to decline or even cease. And they're doing that by putting enormous emphasis on domestic weapons production. This started, I'd say, in the summer of 2023, last year. And it's really ramping up. They've had a lot of success with drone production, with missile production. A lot of these really dramatic attacks that we see far behind enemy lines, far deep inside Russian territory, are done or conducted, these attacks, with Ukrainian-made weapons. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And all of that is a hedge to allow Ukraine to continue fighting, continue defending itself in the event that Western aid continues to decline.
And finally, just going back to the man himself, the showman, Vladimir Zelensky, there were people who thought that were Russia to invade Ukraine, he'd be on the first plane out of there, and that would sort of be the end of it. He not only stayed, he's right at the forefront of it. But obviously, living under the daily threat of assassination, he's got his family to think about as well. How does he cope with all of that? I mean, it's an awful lot to, when you talk to British prime ministers about the weight of responsibility, and they wake up every night with a million things to think about, and that's without, the constant pressure of a war. Tell us a bit about the impact that has on him as a human being.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's two ways that he copes with it. One is a kind of fatalism that I saw in a very pronounced fashion among his aides, where they say, if they drop a bomb on our headquarters, there's nothing we can do about that. We have to continue working. We can't show fear. We can't be cowed and forced into hiding. They made the decision not to hide. Not to run away. So they everything else, they sort of say, well, come what may, we have to continue. And the other thing I think is, he has this approach of not planning too far ahead. One of the reasons he was somewhat ambivalent about my idea for writing this book is like, when's the book going to be published? In a year? Where are we going to be in a year? Where's the war going to be in a year? Are you crazy? I mean, I can't think about that far ahead. So he thinks minute to minute, day to day. What are we doing today to advance, the cause of Ukraine, to bring our victory closer? And he really kind of demands. He's very demanding as a boss of his team and of himself to sort of look at, okay, what's next on the agenda? Bang, bang, bang. To move on to the next thing. And I think that helps him cope psychologically, not to think all that much about the bigger picture.
And I suppose, he's got enough to think about right in front of him without sort of scanning the horizon. Well, listen, it's a fascinating book, and I think it's really, it's a really important moment to sort of pause and think about the guy who everyone had preconceptions about when the war broke out, and to see where we are now and the weight of responsibility. Simon Shuster, author of The Showman, Inside the Invasion That Shook the World and Made a Leader of Vladimir Zelensky. Thanks so much for joining us on Times Radio.
Thank you so much.